terribly good one.
And it's recorded, yes.
Yeah. And it's recorded for, I think, for the first time that my mobile microphone is working, so I can walk back to the classroom, back of the classroom, and tell the joke, which I'll do. I'll walk out of the frame, and theoretically, when you watch the movie later on, my voice will be just as loud because I spent a couple of hours in here working with the podium to make sure it synced with my microphone. What's brown and sounds like a bell? That's right. What, Avery? What's brown and sounds like a bell? Dung.
Oh, you're right. Jimmy's technically right.
Only the best quality. Only the best quality. Most cultured jokes for you guys.
Dude, Jimmy was actually kind of right.
Huh?
Jimmy said poop.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound exactly like a bell.
No. It sounds like.
So here we go. That's where we left off last time. We're going to finish up Virginia today.
What were the standings? Don't remember.
Good morning. Do you know what's brown and sounds like a bell?
What's brown and sounds like a bell?
Dung. Let's put the cell phones away for 50 minutes and focus on Colonial Virginia. Mr. Zuck, is it JJ? Do you go by JJ? Can I single you out for praise?
Sure.
You guys came up with a lot of good stuff on those exercises. I asked you to, if you rule out romance between Pocahontas, 8-year-old Pocahontas, and 30-something John Smith, what other types of things might have been going on? A lot of you guys said, well, she's a kid, and she just instinctively doesn't want to see something like this happen to another human being. Some of you guys said that she thought there was some usefulness to be gained from the English, that they could provide things, and the end of that account definitely supports that. But you had an interesting comment, which was that I think, I can't remember the exact quote, but it showed her significance, Pocahontas's power within the Powhatan tribe. And that's something you don't often think about, but give it a thought for just a moment. Could any normal 8-year-old run out there and do that and change the outcome of what they were doing? Any normal 8-year-old would be dragged off and spanked, because that's interrupting a state proceeding, an execution. But Pocahontas was able to step into the middle of it and actually change the outcome. So that suggests, on the face of it, gives you a pretty good indication she was no ordinary 8-year-old girl. She was somebody very highly placed, respected, with the ability to step into those type of proceedings and change the outcome. So it might just kind of float past you without thinking about it, but it definitely is a demonstration that she was a unique person. She was regarded as a very significant person within the Powhatan chiefdom. And John Smith, this is more than we need probably about Pocahontas, but John Smith calls her the king's daughter, the king's dearest daughter, which is an misunderstanding, because the Powhatans were matrilineal. They were a matrilineal society, which means that family lineage goes through the mother, not the father. We are, for the most part, in South Carolina and many parts of the United States, a patrilineal society. My wife didn't take my name, but more often than not, in our culture, the wife takes the husband's name, and the children are named after the husband. That's patrilineal. So whatever Pocahontas was, if she was a significant person, it was because of her mother. So when John Smith, it's natural to him to think that, because in his culture, the father is the dominant figure. So he calls her the king's dearest daughter. But if she was a significant person, it was not because of her relationship to him. He would not have been that important a figure. In a matrilineal society, it's the mother and the mother's sisters who are the ones who transmit lineage. But however you slice it, whatever interpretation you come up with, that encounter was a demonstration. Maybe it was staged. Several of you guys said it was staged, like a ritual, to make a demonstration. But however you slice it, at the end of the day, it was a demonstration of power. John Smith was shown in no uncertain terms that the Powhatans could kill him if they wanted to. Remember, he had come into Powhatan's chiefdom, Powhatan's domain, without permission, established that fort, was not paying tribute. Every other Indian tribe in the region had to pay tribute, a portion of their corn harvest, part of their deer hunt, to live peaceably within Powhatan's domain. That event in 1608 was a demonstration that the Powhatans had the power to kill John Smith if they wanted to. And at the end of that little passage that we considered, John Smith is allowed to live, and Powhatan gives him the countryside around Jamestown, even adopts him as his son, gives him an Indian name, Algonquin Indian name, Nantiquode, but he asks for some stuff, demands some stuff. The English had no corn. The English couldn't feed themselves. They were not yet growing their own food, so they were having to buy their corn from the Powhatan Indians. So Powhatan could not demand corn like he did from every other tribe. He couldn't demand deer meat, deer hides like he did from other tribes. What he asked for, if you remember at the end of that passage, is 2 great guns, 2 cannons. There were 4. There were 4 cannons in Jamestown Fort in 1608. So basically, he was asking for half of all the colony's cannons. And he wanted a grindstone. We don't use those too much anymore, but you use a grindstone to sharpen your knives, to sharpen your hatchet blade. Do you think? And we know John Smith understood it because that's his account. He wrote it. Do you think when he got back to Jamestown, John Smith rolled 2 cannons out of Jamestown Fort and through the woods and delivered them to Powhatan? See, one person saying no, 2 people are saying no, 3 now are saying no, 4 now are saying no. You could respond a couple of different ways if you were John Smith back in 1608. You might think, oh boy, I'm lucky to be alive. I better do what he says and give him the cannon. You can also imagine him getting back to Jamestown and being kind of shaken by the whole thing and thinking, I better do everything I can to protect myself against these guys going forward, in which case there's no way he's giving away his cannon. And that's the way history worked. John Smith was not about to give away his cannon out of Jamestown Fort. So if it was an agreement, John Smith broke it right away. He did not live up to the terms he himself wrote down that Powhatan had asked for. Powhatan had wanted 2 cannons. John Smith did not. So that's part of the story of Virginia's relationship with Native Americans. This agreement was violated on the English side almost immediately. The cannons were never delivered. And there is an image of John Smith starting a war. I won't harp on the Disney Pocahontas film too much, but if you remember in the Disney version, the cartoon movie, John Smith is depicted as stopping the war by diving in a heroic manner in front of a bullet to save Powhatan's life. That never happened. In reality, John Smith started the war, and you're looking at his own drawing of him starting the war, the first Anglo-Powhatan War. This is, there's John Smith, the shorter man, the taller, and this is a fairly accurate depiction. All of the English, John Smith wrote about it, remarked on how tall the Powhatans were. Average English height in the early 1600s was probably around 5'4", 5'5", 5 feet 5 inches. And they were amazed at the Powhatans, most of them over 6 feet tall. So that difference in height is probably accurate right there in that image. But this is Powhatan's younger brother, Opechancanough. You don't need to remember the name. Do you want me to write it down? You have any interest in such things? Opechancanough. You can shorten it to Opie, just like Andy Taylor's son, if you want to. Well, he was sent forward with bushels of corn to sell to the English. John Smith was there with the Englishmen to buy the corn because, again, they were not feeding themselves. They needed the Powhatan corn to survive. And up until this point, in 1609, the English had been paying for their corn with some cool blue glass beads that the Powhatans had never seen before. But in 1609, Powhatan told his younger brother, Opechancanough, we'll sell the corn, but we no longer want any more. We've got enough glass beads. What we want in payment for the corn now from the English is guns. We will accept as payment guns, gunpowder, bullets. And this is the moment where John Smith grabs Opechancanough and holds a pistol to his head and says, basically, no, we're not going to pay you with guns. We're going to pay you with these cool blue glass beads. He throws them over. So with a gun to his head, they took the glass beads and the English took the corn, but it was the start of war. So First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609 to 1613, which did not go well at all for the English. This is the beginning of 1610, what's called the starving time, because they couldn't feed themselves and the Powhatans were no longer willing to sell them corn. So the English were dying in Jamestown. The turning point, you've got it in that first text block there, the turning point came in 1613, a good 4 years later, after having suffered terribly during that interim. The English launched what might be, by today's military terms, called a surgical strike. They weren't trying to engage in a major battle, but they knew exactly where Pocahontas was, which town she was living in Powhatan territory. And they went straight to that town, grabbed her, evacuated back to English territory, back to the Jamestown fort, 1613, put her in prison. And while in prison, She was visited by John Rolfe, and supposedly, while in prison, fell in love. I don't know if she was really in love with him or just looking for some way out of prison, but supposedly fell in love and married John Rolfe, converted to Christianity while in prison, changed her name to Lady Rebecca, began dressing as an English woman rather than as an Indian. And that was the key. As soon as the English had Pocahontas, and especially once she married John Rolfe, Powhatan pulled back his warriors, and he negotiated for peace, which is another demonstration, another indication that she was quite significant, quite an important person for the Powhatans. So, and in some ways, this works by 1614, the marriage to John Rolfe, worked almost like an arranged diplomatic marriage back in Europe. The kings and queens of Europe would sometimes marry their sons and daughters in order to seal a treaty or arrange to firm up a truce or something of that nature. But once she was in English hands and she had married John Rolfe, peace returned briefly to the Virginia countryside. There's a portrait of her from about 1616, and this might be the closest thing to a life portrait that we have. Many of the others were painted later in time by people who had never really laid eyes on her. But this is from the period when she was Lady Rebecca, dressed as an English woman. 1616, she traveled to London, England, and was a huge celebrity. Immense crowds of Englishmen and women followed her through the streets of London to get a glimpse of the famous Pocahontas. But the Columbian Exchange was at work. If you've ever been to London, maybe you had good fortune with the weather. More often than not, when I go to London, it's kind of gray and overcast. There's a light drizzling rain falling much of the day. She was not used to that type of climate. She was not used to hundreds of people being all around her, coughing and sneezing, things she had never been exposed to. So she got some type of respiratory disease, possibly tuberculosis, and died without ever leaving England. This is not essential information, but if you're intrigued by the John Smith-Pocahontas relationship, this might be of interest. He went to see her when she was dying in London. And this is, again, his account in the general history of Virginia. He went to see her, and as soon as she saw John Smith, she became enraged, so angry she couldn't speak. And she turned away and wouldn't even look at him. He was taken into a waiting room, a separate room, and it took her about 2 hours to calm down enough to go back and greet him. And while he was sitting there, this to me is what makes me think surely they could not have had very much of a relationship back when he was in Virginia, 1607 to 1609. While he was sitting there waiting for her to calm down, he wrote, "Maybe I should have," this is very close to a direct quote, "maybe I should have written to find out if she could speak English." So whatever kind of communication she had, in 1618, he didn't even know if she could speak English or not. But she never returned to Virginia. And for what it's worth, her dad, well, no, let me take that back because he may have been her uncle. Powhatan. Once he learned of her death, Powhatan refused ever again to meet personally with the English. He lived for many years, but he was never again seen. He negotiated from a distance. And war returned. Once Pocahontas was dead, that brief peace, which had been secured by her marriage to John Rolfe, disintegrated. You're looking at an English drawing of a Powhatan attack in 1622. The Powhatan Indians rode up for a surprise attack everywhere. Everywhere the English had settled in Virginia, they showed up and attacked Virginia planters and families. Easily 400 dead as a result. It was a crippling attack on the colony, and from that point forward, there were only rare periods and brief periods of peace. It was a story of chronic, consistent warfare. So the basic message with respect to Native Americans and Virginia was the Virginians settled in a region densely populated, well organized into a powerful chiefdom, and the Virginians experienced early misunderstandings and tension and chronic conflict, chronic warfare with the Powhatans from 1609 onward. Here's our next category. You're looking at a tobacco plant, a picture of a tobacco plant. Pocahontas's husband, John Rolfe, discovered a type of tobacco that was fun to smoke as a recreational thing. I know we're not supposed to do that sort of thing nowadays. The Powhatan Indians already had tobacco, but theirs was a very powerful, somewhat unpleasant tobacco that was used for religious purposes. It had the nicotine had it was so powerful it had an impact on perception. John Rolfe started planting this recreational strain of tobacco in 1612 and discovered he could make money. This was the very first thing the Virginians found that they could make money on. They had not found the Northwest Passage, of course. They never found any gold and silver, but tobacco they discovered people would buy. So all Virginians, or most Virginians with land and the ability to do it, started planting tobacco. And the Virginians never really looked too much further. It was tobacco. Even today, if you drive up north out of North Carolina into southern Virginia, heading towards Richmond, Virginia, you will drive through miles and miles of tobacco fields. Even though fewer people nowadays are smoking tobacco, Virginia is still heavily involved in tobacco agriculture. So they found their crop. Land to plant it, the Virginians could acquire by fighting the Powhatans, but labor was a bit of a challenge. They needed more workers to farm, plant, harvest, process that tobacco. Initially, those workers were indentured servants. You're looking at a contract of indenture. An indentured servant was a worker who signed, or if they couldn't write, they would make an X, and an eyewitness would verify that it was them who made the mark, their personal mark on the document. But they would sign this contract pledging, usually between, in the early days, 4 to 7 years of service, work for a particular employer. They were not free to quit the job. They had to work for that one tobacco planter for 4 to 7 years, whatever length of time was stipulated in the document. And the tobacco planter would also sign, and towards the end of the contract, there were the rewards. The worker promised to work for 4 to 7 years. In return, they were guaranteed some things. Room and board on the plantation, a place to sleep, food to eat. Ship's passage, same thing basically, room and board on a ship. Food to eat for 3 months while you're traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. Beer to drink. Beer because that stayed fresh in a barrel longer than water when you're at sea. And freedom dues. If it was a good contract, especially in the early days, the worker was guaranteed freedom dues. Once they went free, if they lived, which was kind of a catch because Virginia was not very healthy. It was a real death trap in the early days. But if you lived 7 years, whatever the term of your contract was, you would be guaranteed the freedom dues, which could be, frequently, land. The tobacco planter would promise you 50 acres of land, which is a lot. That would be extremely attractive for a young person. And usually these indentured servants were between 18 and 24 years old, white, Christian men, males. There were a few women who did this, but overwhelmingly the population was male in the early days. If you were a young man with no prospects, no education, no wealth to inherit from your family, the idea of 50 acres, if you could live and work for 4 to 7 years, it was pretty darned attractive. And they would be guaranteed oftentimes agricultural tools to do the plowing and so forth, and seed to get started. So it was not an unattractive option. The first African servants / slaves, I have it that way on the screen because Englishmen were a little unclear about the legal status of some of these early African workers in Virginia. Some of them, it's perfectly clear, a significant number of them were working in Virginia as, or perceived as, indentured servants, just like white indentured servants. We know that because a good number of them went free. At the end of 4 to 7 years, they gained their freedom. One of the most famous, if you want to do a little extra research, you don't need to remember the name for our purposes, but Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson arrived as an African on a Dutch ship, I believe, worked as an indentured servant for 4 to 7 years, gained his freedom, got his own land, and he began purchasing white indentured servants to work for him to farm tobacco. So it's clear in the early days the English had not worked the race-based categories out the way they later did. So servants / slaves, some of them never did go free. They, by all appearances, were viewed as slaves at the time. Think about this issue. Let me think of a good way of framing it. The tobacco planters, even though most workers were in white indentured servants, the tobacco planters didn't really want those guys going free. That's one thing they didn't like about white indentured servants. After 4 to 7 years, they would go free. They would have to give them land. And in almost every case, the white indentured servants, or like Anthony Johnson, the black servants, started farming tobacco. So they became competition for the tobacco planters. So they didn't really want the workers to go free. But here's my question. Imagine yourself as a ruthless tobacco planter wanting to make as much money off of your workers, keep them from going free as long as possible. Are there some things, maybe this is the best way of saying it, were there some things that made white indentured servants less vulnerable to abuse of this system than black servants? Can you think of some things? Yeah, yeah. You're looking at the main one, contract. White indentured servants, more often than not, could read and write. Recent arrivals from Africa couldn't speak English. They weren't fluent, maybe couldn't read and write. But white indentured servants had a contract. Black servants did not. And a white servant, even if they were poor, uneducated servants, they knew they could go to an English court of law. If the tobacco planter wasn't setting them free or didn't give them the land they were promised, they could go to court and say, it's in my contract. I'm supposed to be free. So this is a pretty good protection. If you're a black servant / slave with no contract, perhaps unable to speak English, unfamiliar with the English court system, it was much easier for tobacco planters not to set them free at the end of the 7 years. So. And in the 1660s, tobacco planters started making some different choices. In part because disease wasn't quite as much of a problem. In the 1620s and 1630s, oftentimes the indentured servant, whether white or black, would die prior to the end of the contract term. But as disease became less prevalent, as people started living longer, the white indentured servants started surviving in greater numbers and going free. And the tobacco planters in the 1660s started making a choice. 1650s, 1660s, a choice to buy life-term African slaves rather than white indentured servants. And as they did so, they encountered some problems. That transformation happened very rapidly. They started buying life-term African slaves in the 1660s. By 1700, the labor force had almost entirely converted. In the early 1600s, it was predominantly white indentured servants working in those tobacco fields. By 1700, if you were watching one of those tobacco fields, looking out at the tobacco field, it would be majority African slave labor. Maybe a few, maybe a handful of white indentured servants still out there, but the labor force had transformed in a single generation, 40 years, 1660s to 1700. Thank you. Good job. And Virginians, the tobacco planters, the politicians in control of Virginia, discovered that the old laws no longer worked for this new type of labor. They had to start passing some new laws. I'll read it out because it's obscured by our camera here. The slave codes were several dozen laws passed by the Virginia House of Burgesses, the state legislature, the colonial legislature. So that's LAWS, laws. Laws passed to govern the institution of slavery from the 1660s to 1700. Let me give you a couple of examples. As Virginia started practicing life-term slavery, it discovered that there were escape routes by which slaves could gain their freedom. One of them, in the early days, 1660s, was Christianity. The slave owners originally, in the 1640s and 1650s, had said it's justifiable to enslave, to never let African laborers go free because they're not Christian. They're not Christian and therefore not entitled to freedom. As a result of which, some slaves very wisely converted to Christianity and then went to the courts and said, I'm now Christian, I should be free. And the courts agreed, and they were freed. So Virginia had to pass a law, which was simply, conversion to Christianity does not guarantee freedom. That's one of the very first of the slave codes, the laws enforcing slavery. Another quick example, and then I'm going to ask you guys to read one, an actual slave code. Oftentimes, this is an unpleasant topic to talk about, but oftentimes slave masters had relationships with enslaved women. Sometimes perhaps consensual, in many cases not consensual. And children were born of mixed ancestry. The mothers of those children went to court, took their children with them in some cases, not all of them, but in many cases, enough to make the Virginians nervous, went to court with their kids and said to the judge, the father of this child is free. Therefore, the child should be free. And the court set them free. So a law was passed, another of the slave codes. A law was passed stating that the condition of the mother, think about this for a moment. This is quite disturbing. The condition of the mother legally determines the status of the child. Does that make sense? So if the mother is enslaved, the child is a slave. Now, they could have done it the other way around. Think about some of the reasons why not. They could have said the status of the father determines the status of the child, in which case they would all go free. So, here is another law from the 1660s. This one's from 1669. An act about the casual killing of slaves. I'm just going to ask you to read through it and write a paragraph. I don't mean to make you feel bad. Only one or two people did this, but the instructions last time were to write a paragraph. A couple of people wrote one sentence. And I went ahead and gave you credit. But one sentence ain't a paragraph. We need at least 4 sentences to be considered something like a paragraph. But write a paragraph answering some of the questions you have here. You got the text of the law. Take one and pass it along, please. And then we'll talk about it just a little bit. In that first line, refractory. Refractory means disobedient. Disobedient servants. But let me just ask you to think about something. And as I said, feel free to keep doing your own thing. According to the law, according to the language, whereas the only law enforced for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master, not obeying their master, cannot be inflicted upon Negroes. So right there you have a tip-off that something is different about slavery. The existing laws for white indentured servants. If a white indentured servant, and let's think about it for just a second, what it might be. If you have a white indentured servant, let's say you're a ruthless tobacco planter. If you have a white indentured servant who won't obey, won't get out there and work, are there things you can do? Short of beating them up, short of whipping them? So some people are saying no, but think about it. There are things that can be done, that could be done and were done, that could scare that white indentured servant. Remember their contract? They're supposed to go free in 4 to 7 years. If they didn't work, the tobacco planter could tell the worker, the indentured servant, if you don't get out there and do what I tell you to do, I'm going to go to court and add 2 years, 3 years to the contract. And you won't go free until 10 years. If they're expecting 50 acres of land, the tobacco planter could say to that white indentured servant, if you don't listen to me and do what I tell you to do, I'm not going to give you 50 acres of land. Those were powerful. Those were powerful ways of correcting behavior. Now, if a tobacco planter has a life-term slave who won't obey, can that planter threaten additional years? Huh? Yep. Threatening to add a year, if someone has no hope of freedom ever, threatening to add a year is absurd. It has no meaning. It works only for white indentured servants. Threatening to withhold 50 acres of land has no meaning. So, beating, physical violence. And this is my last point of the day. It's a very unhappy topic to think about. By its nature, slavery was different. By its nature, it rested at bottom. The foundation of slavery was the threat of physical violence. That's fundamentally different from what had come before. So when you're done with your worksheet, bring it on up.